Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. We are on Facebook and Twitter. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. This month, I'd like to let you know that the Agora Podcast Network is a great place to advertise. The Agora Podcast Network is currently accepting advertisement spots for 2019. This is an excellent opportunity to get your business or enterprise great exposure to a wide market of listeners. You can get more information by sending an email to our advertising team, which is info@agorapodcastnetwork.com. You might have noticed that I left the platform of Patreon. There's many reasons for this, and this decision has really been a long time coming. I never loved running advertisements, which is part of my agreement with Acast as I run advertisements. But on top of that, constantly asking for pledges on Patreon and doing all sorts of housekeeping about Patreon. I also really don't like many of the things that Patreon's been doing lately and a lot of the things they're talking about doing in the future. Apparently, a lot of my patrons didn't like it either because they told me so. If you really want to donate, now that I'm no longer on Patreon, but definitely never feel obliged to donate. But if you do, you can go to the website a2zhistorypage.com where you can do a one-time or monthly donation via PayPal, which I think is actually better than Patreon because there's less fees, but I don't know all the details of that. But I have PayPal, use PayPal a lot and like it. But anyways, you can also use the Amazon wish list in the show notes. That option of supporting the show is really helpful and fun too. Above all, I thank you for listening. That's the most important part. Thank you for listening. And with all these changes, there's going to be a lot less talking about this sort of thing and donations and all sorts of things like that. And we'll be getting right into the episodes. Well, one other little plug. If you want to send in iTunes reviews, I really appreciate those. Good ones, bad ones, whatever you're thinking, they really help me learn more about what I'm doing in this show. So I really appreciate that. Anyways, let's get into this episode, which is episode 77, Popes of the mid-6th century. Now, it's been some time since we talked about Vigilius and the story surrounding the Fifth Ecumenical Council. This is the Second Council of Constantinople, which, as you might guess, took place in Constantinople in the year 553. This episode has been a difficult one for me to figure out about how to put it all together, and that's why it's taken some time. There were many different events happening in different places that all overlapped. So please accept my apologies. And with that, let's do a quick little recap of Vigilius leading into what we're going to talk about today. One other thing is that this time period really gets sandwiched into Gregory the Great's papacy, which we'll get into soon. So there's a little bit of inconvenience in here and of why scholars and historians and even ancient church historians didn't have much time for this period of the papacy and church history, which we're about to find ourselves in. First, let's talk a little bit about Justinian. He was the emperor, of course, of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, and he fancied himself something of a great theologian. He held the Chalcedonian line, the Council of Chalcedon, that is, from 451. In short, from that council, we get that Jesus had two natures, both fully divine and fully human. They're not all jumbled together, though. They are distinct and separate natures. This was all at odds with mostly represented by the Patriarch and See of Alexandria in Egypt. To the Miaphysites, Jesus has one nature, which is a composite of divinity and humanity. Humanity and divinity are separate and distinct inside of that one nature, though. This is really heavy-duty, serious, theological, and philosophical hair-splitting. But it was and is a big deal in Christianity, this Christology. Justinian's concern was, and it's similar concern to almost every other emperor to this point, he wants unity and peace. He wants religious unity amongst Christians so that he would lead peace, which would lead peace in the empire. Egypt was in constant turmoil. Persians were constantly a serious enemy and a danger, like an existential danger to the empire. And there's even constant unrest in Constantinople. Now we get back to Italy, where the papacy is, and there's these Gothic wars. Justinian invaded Vandal North Africa and conquered it pretty quickly and easily. He went ahead and invaded Italy thinking the same thing would happen, but not quite. There was wars, plagues, crop failures, destruction of infrastructure, famine, and all the usual things that accompany war fell on Italy. I mean, it basically ravaged the place, destroyed it. The Ostrogoths fell after a ton of fighting and destruction, just one destruction after another. And there's an environmental collapse going on in that. We're leading into a mini ice age, too. It's getting very cold, and the climate basically sucks. I mean, there's no other way to put it. Well, there might be, but I like that one. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire, they at this point have some degree of control over Italy. Vigilius, and we'll give a quick recap of Vigilius and the Fifth Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Constantinople in 553. Vigilius became pope after some unusual circumstances, if you remember. There was the whole Pope Silverius was removed and then exiled. He dies under unusual circumstances. Vigilius slid into the papacy with the support of Justinian. And it's just so that likely that maybe he made a pact to support Justinian and Theodora. Vigilius tried to stand up to Justinian, but then he would back down. And none of this looked good back in Rome. Then we bring in the 3 chapters, which is a really big deal and easily the biggest issue of the day, besides the whole Miaphysite, Diophysite thing. This 3 chapters, and for what we really are thinking about in the papacy, this 3 chapters is even bigger than that. These 3 chapters are the selected writings of 3 important Antiochene thinkers / bishops. There was Theodore, bishop of Mapasuestia. He died all the way back in 428 in full communion with the church. Justinian and the Miaphysites wanted all of his writings and him personally anathematized. He's said to be Nestorian before Nestorius because he was actually an influence on Nestorius. He held to this Diophysite position before the term Nestorian got attached to it. And this shows that the Diophysite position of Antioch was quite popular before Nestorius even hit the scene. Much like the theology of Arius, as Arius was the leading spokesman for this school of theological thought, the poster boy for this Diophysite position, even though it wasn't actually a lot of his thinking. Now, back to Arius, I'm thinking and I'm planning on doing an episode on subordinationist Christian theology and its various offshoots, semi-Arianism in particular, and Gothic Christianity, which it still has a part to play in our story. It's not gone at all yet. The second person who falls into these 3 chapters is Theodoret, bishop of Cyrus, and some of his selected writings that get called into question as being Diophysite or Nestorian. Then you have Ebos, who is the bishop of Edessa, a letter that he wrote to Maris, who was bishop of Hardashir in Persia. That's interesting. There's strong communications between Roman and Persian Christians. These Diophysite Nestorian Christians had already spread and were strong in Persia. Edessa, which is kind of in the general area. If you think about it now, you can look at a quick map. It's generally where like Turkey, Syria, and Iraq all meet together. And Edessa was a major center of what we would call Diophysite Eastern Nestorian Christianity. Really, we could probably even go back to the Third Ecumenical Council. Both the Miaphysites and the Chalcedonians would make it so uncomfortable for this now Persian brand of Christianity to even survive even in the eastern extreme of the Byzantine Empire. And that was really why they moved to Persia. But really, by the time of the Fifth Ecumenical Council, they're really in Persia now because they know they really don't have a home in the Eastern Roman Empire. Then the great school of Edessa would move further to the east into Nisibis. Now, Christianity was really growing in Persia, and there were many factors for that. The Persian government at this time at least, was less likely to persecute Christians. Then Christianity got a major boost when Islam conquered Iran, Persia. Islam really wasn't into huge mass conversion early on. In fact, they made it difficult for people to convert, and they had many reasons for that. Islam was perceived in the early days as a religion of Arab identity, and the Arab ruling class wanted to keep the religion in-house, so to speak. So these non-Muslim people of the book had to pay the special jizya poll tax, which was a major source of revenue for early Islam. So that was another kind of factor that made them not want to have huge conversions to Islam. Now you have the Zoroastrians, who were the majority of the Persians. They were not people of the book. So they were open to major persecution. Conversion to Islam was not an easy route, but conversion to Christianity and in the big scope of things, the lighter jizya was an open route to the Zoroastrians. And this was a popular choice among the scholarly class of Zoroastrians and some of the upper classes of Iran, Persia. This led to an amazing flourishing of Christianity in the former Persian Empire, which eventually spread throughout Central Asia and into the lands of China and Japan, just a little bit past our time here in the mid-6th century. This is another area that I have a lot of materials on and I'm exploring, in which I hope to do a short series of episodes on. I believe it's important to discuss the spread of Christianity into the East because it's a great story, and it fits into the bigger picture of how Christianity spread in the ancient and early medieval world. Anyways, back to the 3 chapters who were condemned at Fifth Ecumenical Council. Pope Vigilius, after many trials and tribulations, condemned them as well, condemned these 3 chapters. That did not go over well in the West, particularly in Gaul, northern Italy, and Africa. And that's pretty much the whole West when you get down to brass tacks. Spain doesn't come up, but I'm going to talk a lot more about Christianity in Spain. The Roman class in Spain was Christian as it ever was, but the Visigoth ruling class was Arian, semi-Arian subordinationist. That was about to change, but we'll talk about that in more detail soon. Christianity was about to come back online in Britain after quite a while as well. The island was still under pagan control, but it had a population of Romano-British who were still Christian, but they were the underclass to the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, which was still very pagan. This is a big prelude to get to the rest of the story, but worth it because it'll put what's coming up in context. Vigilius caved on everything, big time, and that made him an unpopular fellow in the West. Luckily for him, he died in Sicily en route back to Rome, so he didn't have to take the heat for all the fallout of the things he did during this Fifth Ecumenical Council. In the meanwhile, as Vigilius traveled back with his tail between his legs from Constantinople, a couple other things were happening. Councils were held all over the West, condemning and even excommunicating Vigilius. So you can see why this period of history pretty much gets fast-forwarded in the West to get to Gregory the Great. It isn't great for optics for papal primacy and later supremacy, this narrative for a pope to be excommunicated by the bishops who he was supposed to be supreme over. Luckily for Rome, a more capable and shrewd pope took over, and this man was named Pelagius I, and his reign was from April 556 to March 561. He's a real insider in both Rome and Constantinople. He was an advisor for Pope Agapitus way back in the 530s and was his representative in Constantinople. He's the usual high-ranking deacon from a wealthy family. This is sometimes called the aristocracy papacy. Now, Pelagius, he was hip-deep in this whole scandal situation to get Vigilius elected and replace Silverius. And he's said to have worked out this plan with the Empress Theodora. Who knows about that? That could just be talk to make him look bad and look the scheming Theodora, etc., etc. But he was very tight with Justinian and Theodora. He was the papal apocrisiarius, or nuncio, ambassador, what have you, for Vigilius in Constantinople. And like I said, he was right in the middle of things for the Fifth Ecumenical Council. And he fled with Vigilius and worked with the Roman clergy in Constantinople and the Constantinople establishment. Real insider stuff. Eventually, he turned on Vigilius over his condemnation of the 3 chapters. Pelagius went through a 180-degree change of position, flip-flop, as you might say in the modern political jargon. He was against the condemnation of the 3 chapters with Vigilius, but then swung around again to actually condemn them to appease Theodora and Justinian. As you might imagine, this left a very bad taste in the mouth of the bishops in Italy and Gaul. And he wound up traveling back with Vigilius to Rome when Vigilius died in Sicily. He was eventually elected pope with a ton of support, i.e. arm twisting, by Justinian. And the support he had in Constantinople really, got him over the top, even though he was unpopular in Rome. For all that, he, as you could imagine, he had a very difficult time finding a bishop to even consecrate him as pope. It took over a year for him to finally be installed as pope. But for all of that, he used all of his resources, his personal, financial, and the garnering the support of the Roman financial system to stabilize and support Rome and central Italy during the devastating Gothic Wars and its aftermaths. He used Justinian's pragmatic sanctions a lot to control civil authority, and he reformed financial administration. He also used the pragmatic sanction authority and his personal wealth to alleviate starvation, work with local authorities to just basically stabilize things for the people and the secular government, because there really wasn't anybody left to hold the bag. Local Roman and central Italian attitudes started to slowly change for him for the positive. He was still hated in northern Italy, Gaul, and even accused of killing Vigilius. He was excommunicated by the bishops of northern Italy and Gaul. Pelagius tried to use the Eastern Roman authorities to punish them, but the powers that be in Ravenna didn't want to have anything to do with that. And then Pelagius died in 561 and was fairly popular in Rome. Now, the next pope was named John III, and his reign went from July 561 to July 574, so a pretty long reign of 13 years. Little is known of his papacy, though. He was from the usual rich aristocratic family, and some of the main events of his papacy was really the main event was the Lombard invasion of Italy. Now here's a really short story of the Lombards. They were an Eastern Germanic people from somewhere north of the Alps, probably from southern Scandinavia. And they follow the usual Germanic barbarian story. They moved around a bit in northern and eastern Europe, and they were a mix of Germanic pagans and Germanic Aryan Christians, which probably you could have said that for the Ostrogoths, especially early on. Now, in the early to mid 500s, they just tore through the area of the northern Alps and into Italy. One of their famous kings was a king by the name of Alboin, and he took the invasion into Italy and just progressively conquered south and set up duchies as he went. And a lot of these duchies are things that are going to hang around in Italy for a long, long time. Now, they may have come into Italy at the request of the Byzantines, but maybe not. There was a popular conspiracy theory among the Romans at that time that the Byzantines actually were the ones who invited them in. If you want to learn more about the Lombards, especially their very early histories, I would suggest you listen to Ben Jacobs' Wittenberg to Westphalia podcast. He really did a great job discussing the Lombards and their importance, because their importance cannot be discounted. They make the huge impact early on, but they kind of set the stage for what's going to happen into the Middle Ages and even into the Renaissance. A lot of the things that happened in the 700s are still impacting things hundreds of years after they're gone. In fact, I think that listening to his episodes on the Lombards are almost essential and required reading for this podcast. So you probably want to go back and forth. The History of Italy is another great resource as well that you can go to. He's done some great episodes about this time. Now, chances are I will come around and do a history of the Lombards, particularly their religious history as well. But they become Romanized very quickly. Now, for John III, the big deal was what to do with these Lombards invading and even making things that were a mess in central Italy even a bigger mess. John tried desperately to get help from the famous Byzantine general Narses, and he even left Rome to get help. The Roman aristocracy viewed John as just way too Byzantine, and for a while he wasn't even welcome back in the city of Rome. He had to operate out in the catacombs outside of town. A quick note, at this point, when I refer to Rome and the Romans, I'm probably just talking specifically about the actual city of Rome and the people in the city of the outskirts of Rome. There's no more idea, especially in the west, of Rome as the Roman Empire. We're zeroing in here now on Rome, the city, the Roman papacy, and the environs around Rome. Now, for that's about it for John III. We'll move on. A long reign with more concerns about administration than theology or religion. Of course, don't forget, the Schism of the Three Chapters is still going on. Another quick pope to discuss is Benedict I, and his reign was from 575 to 579. This is where we see a total breakdown in communication between Rome and Constantinople. It took Benedict nearly a year to get officially confirmed by Constantinople and to get that word back to Rome. Constantinople provided almost no relief to Rome from the plagues, famines, and attacks of the Lombards. Now, it is possible that, Benedict I, was probably the one who recruited Gregory the Great before he was great, but he was still probably great. I mean, let's be honest, he was probably great, to join the papal administration. Benedict died from a set of famines and plagues that hit Rome during this time. But since we have a little break in here between Benedict and the next, since we didn't have to say much about Benedict, let's talk about the title of Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, which is starting to pick up steam about this time. This word ecumenical comes from a Greek word oikumene, which means universal, therefore universal patriarch. The ecumenical patriarch, or sometimes we'll just refer to him as the EC, made claims to being the most powerful bishop in the world, even over the Pope of Rome. Obviously, the popes of Rome disagreed with this assertion. Now, the title was thrown around a bit in the early 500s, but it really stuck at about this time in the mid to late 500s. And I tell you, this title always stuck in the craw of the popes of Rome. Now, Justinian's new constitution's law code of 534 officially called the Bishop of Constantinople Ecumenical Patriarch. This title of ecumenical also was used for many other high-ranking Byzantine administrations, so it's kind of maybe almost making an administrative smoothing things over administratively and not giving the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople more powers. Not at this point. Now, there was and is an unbelievable amount of debate over what the title of ecumenical patriarch means and how much authority the Archbishop or Patriarch of Constantinople really had, and in the modern context has, over worldwide Christianity, particularly in the modern context, modern Eastern Orthodox Christianity. I am working on some other modern, more current events episodes as well, but that one's particularly interesting because it ties back all the way to what we're talking about now. The last pope we'll talk about today is Pelagius II, who reigned from November of 579 to February 590. So another long reign for a pope. Pelagius II was the son of a Goth father, a Goth guy. He was consecrated during a siege of Rome by the Lombards, and he never got official okay from Constantinople. Pelagius II is actually the one who sent Gregory the Great to Constantinople as the nuncio or apocrypharius. He also used Gregory as an intermediary with bishops involved in the continuing schism of the three chapters. Let's talk about the main area of rebellion in this schism of the three chapters. This is the place where it was really the hottest and where a lot of interesting theological, Christological, and church organization issues come out of. If you picture the Adriatic Sea, most of the bishops involved were from the small part of the top section of the Adriatic, basically from the area of modern-day Venice all the way around to the Istrian Peninsula, which is not a huge amount of territory if you look at the map. Particularly, the bishops of places like Grotto and Aquileia tried to exert a huge amount of independence and even giving themselves the title of patriarch. The title patriarch switched back and forth between Grotto and Aquileia, but during this time period, the importance of both of these cities really decreased over time, and Venice became the big player. Eventually, the Bishop of Venice would take the title of patriarch, which he inherited from these bishops of Grotto and Aquileia. The whole story of the power fight between the Franks versus the Lombards versus the Byzantines gave the bishops of this little sliver of land along the northern Adriatic a very large amount of independence from Rome. These bishops of Grotto and Aquileia were the first bishops to be styled patriarch after the big ones that we talk about a lot: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. So now we don't think of patriarch being used very much in the Western Church. There's really only Rome, Lisbon, and Venice, where it's the Eastern churches that really took off with this idea of patriarch, where they have Moscow and Romania has one, Bulgaria has one, and Serbia, and many others. It was really a Latin Western innovation to spread that title. It would kind of be interesting to see what might have happened if these areas of northern Italy were able to exert more independence, what might have happened. Let's get back to Pelagius II for a second. He tried to get the Franks to help and attack the Lombards, and he also worked to firm up the Franks into the Orthodox Catholic camp. By this point, the popes of Rome were the main actors in secular diplomacy and administration in central Italy. They may have been officially consecrated and appointed by Constantinople, but the popes were all in name independent players in the political scene in Italy. One side fact During the reign of Pelagius II, the Third Council of Toledo occurred in Visigothic Spain. This is when the king of the Visigoths, Macabre, officially converted from Arianism to Catholic Christianity. And we're going to have an episode about the Visigoths coming up. I can't wait. I'm a little bit too much excited about talking about the Visigoths. But in 590, Pelagius II died during a burst of plague caused by the flooding of the Tiber, and now enters Gregory the Great. But that is for next time. I really sincerely appreciate you taking the time to listen. We've got a lot to talk about in upcoming episodes. I have many episodes planned and even recorded, and I'm really excited to get into many interesting and fascinating stories. Of course, always send me, if you have show ideas, something like for me to talk about in a little bit more detail, maybe an interesting guest possibility. I'm open to all of it. So definitely hit me up through Facebook, Twitter, email, etc., etc. And as always, I look forward to seeing you on our next step on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.